The year is 773. Picture this: Lindisfarne, a tiny, windswept island off England's northeast coast. It's supposed to be a sanctuary, a holy place, one of the most sacred spots in the country. The monastery there, it's not just a religious hub, it's a symbol of peaceful Christian civilization. Its library stuffed with precious manuscripts, a haven for monks lost in prayer. As these monks are deep in their devotions, serene and quiet, strange silhouettes slice through the misty sea. Not merchant ships, definitely not any English boats they've ever seen. These are long, lean, moving with terrifying speed, their prows carved into snarling dragon heads that practically breathe fear into your soul. The Vikings. They hit the beach like a damn thunderbolt, armed to the teeth with swords and axes, as silent as wraiths and as savage as a hurricane. They storm the monastery. Monks, men who'd never so much as touched a weapon in their lives, are hacked down where they stand, no chance to fight back. Treasures are ripped from altars, holy icons smashed to pieces, sacred texts, copied by hand with painstaking care over decades, are stolen or set ablaze. And then, as suddenly as they came, the invaders are gone, vanished, leaving behind nothing but smoking ruins, sprawled corpses, and a crushing silence fit only for a graveyard. This raid wasn't just the first known Viking attack on England, it was a deep psychological blow, striking right at the heart of Christian belief in the British Isles. The English felt like actual demons had clawed their way out of the sea to punish them for some sin they didn't even know they'd committed. Chroniclers of the time wrote about it, their words heavy with grief and bewilderment. Some saw it as a sign from God, the beginning of the end of the world. But it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the Viking Age, an era that would span 2 centuries and transform England from a quiet, pious land into a relentless battleground, a bloody struggle for the crown. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Whispers of Time channel. Before we start, I hope you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so that you receive all the new content. And also share the story with your friends so it reaches as many people as possible. And if you have a story, write it in the comments. Maybe we'll choose one to narrate in the next video. Let's start the story. Pay attention because there's a small detail that might change your entire perspective and awareness of life. Way back in the dawn of the Middle Ages, when Europe was just a chaotic, ever-changing mess, waves of humanity, totally fearless, surged from the north. Their sails carried the tang of the sea and the grit of countless battles. These were the Vikings, a warrior tribe out of Scandinavia, ready to etch their legacy into England's memory with cold steel and roaring fires. But here's the thing. Was their invasion just a bunch of random hit-and-runs, or was there something more to it, something deeper? Was it like a slow burn, building into an existential fight that would reshape England's politics and culture for centuries to come? The Vikings, see, they didn't show up for the loot. Nah, their ambitions went way beyond that. So what was their real motivation for these non-stop invasions? Were they just short on resources back home? Or were they actually trying to build a whole new empire? And as time rolled on, did their goals shift from just grabbing gold and stuff to taking over land and setting up colonies? When they first started hitting England, were they just pirates, plain and simple, or did they pretty quick become a major force, actively shaping the history of the island? And how did their view of England change, with every single battle they won, every town that fell into their hands? After that Lindisfarne raid, nothing in England was ever the same again. What the English thought was just a shocking one-off attack turned out to be the first alarm bell of a new age of terror, the Viking raids. And now that they'd tasted English gold and seen how weak the defenses were, they came back, again and again. Every summer, the English coastlines would be scanned with pure dread. If those longships appeared on the horizon, people would scramble, either run for their lives or try to hide in monasteries, thinking somehow that holiness would protect them from iron and fire. Spoiler, it didn't. In the beginning, the Viking raids were fast, like lightning strikes. They'd land on the coast, ransack a village or a monastery, and then pull out before any local forces could even think about stopping them. They relied on their incredible speed and their pinpoint knowledge of the rivers and waterways. Their ships, get this, were designed to cut deep into the mainland, sailing up rivers just as easily as they sailed the open sea. This let them attack inland towns that never, ever imagined they'd see an attack from the sea. But as the years went by, something shifted in how they were doing things. It wasn't just about the gold anymore, it was about the land. Some of them started setting up camps, building forts, even farming the land. They saw England as a chance for a stable life, fertile lands, a sky that wasn't as harsh as their frozen north. Not all Vikings were full-time warriors, you know. A lot of them were farmers, traders, craftsmen, just looking for a new place to start over. And so, the raids slowly but surely turned into an occupation. An occupation that didn't happen with one massive army all at once, but with little waves, gradually putting down roots in English soil. The real turning point came in 865. That's when what the Anglo-Saxon records call the Great Heathen Army landed in England. This wasn't some ordinary raid, man. This was an invasion, pure and simple. The army was led by Viking brothers, the most famous being Ivar Ragnarsson, also known as Ivar the Boneless. Talk about a mysterious dude. Legends swirled around him. Some said he couldn't feel pain, or that he moved back crawling because he had no bones in his body. Probably just a way of describing how ruthless and strategic he was. This army kicked off its campaign in the Kingdom of Northumbria, tearing through it and taking its capital. The small, squabbling kingdoms of England, they just couldn't stand up to this new onslaught. They were fragmented, always fighting each other, lacking any unified, decisive leadership. One by one, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell to the Vikings, East Anglia, Mercia, and parts of Kent. And it wasn't just brutal, it was organized. The Vikings set up local administrations, collected taxes, imposed their own laws, and started building their own society right there in this new land. So, England wasn't one country anymore. It was split, a south still clinging to its Anglo-Saxon identity, and a north and east living under the Viking banner, under a new name, the Danelaw, meaning the land ruled by Danish law. At this point, it really looked like nothing could stop them, like all of England was about to be swallowed by this Norse tide coming from Scandinavian shores. But history, as always, is never static. Facing this flood, a fierce resistance was about to rise, led by one single figure who would make all the difference and carve his name into the nation's memory forever. In the heart of this long night the Vikings cast over England, while Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were crumbling one after another, a king rose in the south unlike any other. He wasn't particularly tall, didn't have some overwhelming military presence, but he had something far more valuable, a sharp mind and an unbreakable will. His name was Alfred, King of Wessex, the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom still standing amidst the storm. When Alfred took the throne in 871, Wessex was reeling from relentless attacks, the Vikings pressing in on its borders with everything they had. It seemed like its fall was just a matter of time, especially after the Great Heathen Army had conquered Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. There wasn't much hope in sight, and Wessex didn't have a strong standing army, just local levies and tribes that weren't exactly well organized. But Alfred, he didn't give up. From day one, he understood that victory wasn't just about how many swords you had, but about smart planning. He started organizing defenses, restructured his army, and divided the land into defensive zones that could respond quickly to any attack. He established what's now known as the Burr system, fortified strongholds like mini castles that local fighters could rally around when trouble hit. Still, it wasn't an easy road. In 878, the Vikings launched a surprise winter attack on Wessex, a time when no one expected fighting. They hit the royal camp at Chippenham and almost captured Alfred himself. The king had to flee, escaping into the swamps of Athelney, vanishing from sight. There, in the heart of that marshy, cold wilderness, he lived as a fugitive, hiding among peasants, leading the resistance from the shadows. Legend has it that during this time, he was holed up in a woman's cottage. She was baking bread and asked him to watch it while she stepped out. But Alfred, his mind totally consumed by the war, forgot about the loaves until they burned. The woman, having no idea she was scolding a king in disguise, really laid into him. What do you think, at that moment, what should he have done? How do you keep hope alive when you're a king brought that low? But Alfred wasn't finished, not by a long shot. A few months later, he emerged from hiding, rallied what was left of his army, and managed to inspire his people once more. At the decisive Battle of Edington, he faced the Viking forces led by Guthrum and crushed them in a bloody fight. This victory wasn't just military, it was political too. Alfred forced the Viking leader, Guthrum, into negotiations, leading to one of the most important treaties in Anglo-Saxon history, the Treaty of Wedmore. Under this treaty, the Vikings agreed to withdraw from Wessex lands, and Guthrum himself converted to Christianity, getting baptized with Alfred as his godfather and taking the Christian name Athelstan. And just like that, England was officially divided into two distinct zones, the south and west under Wessex and Alfred's control, and the north and east under Viking rule known as the Danelaw. But Alfred wasn't content with just defending his kingdom. Once he'd secured his position, he launched a long-term project to rebuild his country from the inside out. He focused on education, ordered the translation of Latin books into Old English, established a solid legal system, and encouraged reading and writing at a time when illiteracy was common, even among nobles. He believed that a nation isn't built by the sword alone, but by knowledge too. By the end of his reign, Wessex hadn't just survived, it had become the core of a new England. Alfred had stopped the Viking advance and proved that no matter how strong the storm, it could break against a steadfast rock that knew when to bend and when to resist. And for that, he wasn't just a king. History remembers him by a title given to no other English monarch, the Great. As the decades rolled by, the image of Vikings in England started to slowly change. They weren't just strangers anymore, coming off the sea to wreck everything and then disappear. They became part of the everyday scene. Neighbors, husbands, traders, farmers. Ever since they'd properly settled in the north and east of England, in the Danelaw, a quiet but profound transformation began. Not one recorded by swords, but woven into the tiny details of daily life. The Vikings started to blend in with the local folks, not just by living alongside them, but through culture, religion, and language. When the Vikings first invaded England, they brought their pagan gods with them. Odin, Thor, Freya, and all their rituals of fire and, yes, human sacrifice. This, understandably, terrified the Anglo-Saxon Christians, who saw the Vikings as enemies of God more than just enemies of the king. But over time, as the Vikings settled down on English land, a shift towards Christianity began. This wasn't always about sudden personal conviction. Often, it was part of political deals, like when the leader Guthrum got baptized after Alfred the Great beat him. He took a Christian name and participated in church rites. And large groups of Vikings followed suit, whether out of genuine belief or for practical reasons, like fitting into society. Besides religion, Vikings also integrated into the rural economy. They were farmers back home, before they were warriors, and they found England's soil fertile, great for crops and raising livestock. They started their own farms, learned from their new neighbors how to use local farming tools, and even brought in some new tools and techniques from Scandinavia. Trade picked up between the Danelaw areas and the Anglo-Saxon South. Mixed markets popped up where Vikings and Britons traded goods, silver, and crafts. Language, too, became another field of mixing. Old Norse started seeping into Old English, and there was a whole lot of linguistic overlap. So many words became part of everyday use, especially in the Danelaw. Words like sky, egg, window, knife, even law, all of them are originally Norse words that became a totally natural part of the English language. This language swap wasn't just one way. It was proof of long-term coexistence, where one language isn't forced on another, but they grow together organically. In social life, intermarriage between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons started happening. It was rare at first, but it quickly became common. These marriages produced a new generation, a kind of hybrid identity, not purely Norse, not purely Anglo-Saxon. This new generation often spoke both languages, lived between two sets of customs, and worshipped one god. They didn't see Vikings as invaders, but as fathers and uncles, and they didn't see Anglo-Saxons as enemies, but as relatives and friends. So, what started as a bloody conflict turned into a complex web of human relationships. Cities that the Vikings founded or rebuilt, like York, Jorvik, became bustling urban centers, home to merchants from all sorts of backgrounds, where daily life was run by a mix of Anglo-Saxon and Norse administrative practices. Even architecture started to reflect this diversity. You'd see houses with a Scandinavian design right next to English churches. By the 10th century, you couldn't really talk about Vikings in the old sense in Eastern England. They'd simply become the New English. They weren't living in fortified camps anymore, but in settled homes. They weren't collecting plunder, but taxes. They weren't fighting for land, but for laws that protected them. The lines between invader and invaded had blurred. War had turned into coexistence, then into an unspoken unity that was taking shape on the ground every single day, in the fields, in the markets, in homes, and in the language of children. The Vikings had carved out a permanent place for themselves in the heart of England, not as an occupying force, but as part of the new nation that was still being forged. Despite all those years of Vikings and Anglo-Saxons living together, the shadow of invasion never really disappeared from the horizon. The relationship between the Norse peoples and England stayed complicated, a mix of assimilation, simmering resentment, and political shifts that were bound to explode eventually. As the 11th century kicked off, the North Sea once again spat out a new generation of invaders from its depths. But this time, they weren't coming as pirates or settlers, they were coming as kings, staking a claim to the English throne itself. England, under King Ethelred the Unready, a pretty unfortunate nickname, was struggling. It was weak internally, plagued by corrupt administration, and there was constant tension with the Danish settlers already in the country. Ethelred, in a desperate attempt to keep things balanced, made a disastrous decision in 1002. He ordered a wholesale massacre of Danes living in England, trying to get rid of what he saw as a fifth column. Hundreds, maybe thousands of men, women, and children were killed, including relatives of Danish royalty. This was a massive turning point. What do you reckon was going through his head? Did he think this would solve anything? The backlash didn't take long. King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark decided that the blood of his people couldn't just be ignored. He launched a series of major invasions of England. These weren't like the old quick raids. These were organized military campaigns aimed at conquering the entire country. And Sweyn actually managed to subdue most of England. Ethelred had to flee to Normandy, and Sweyn became the de facto king of England, right before he suddenly died in 1014. But his death didn't end Danish ambition. His son, Canute, who at first was just a young guy, pretty much a stranger to England, inherited his father's drive and kept up the war against the English. Even though he faced resistance from Ethelred and then from Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside, Canute managed to defeat them, especially in the crucial Battle of Assunden in 1016. Instead of completely crushing King Edmund, they agreed to split the country. But then death came quickly for Edmund just a few months later. So Canute ended up with sole rule, becoming the first official Danish king on the English throne. Canute wasn't a tyrant, though. He was a smart ruler, blending political ruthlessness with administrative wisdom. Once he had a firm grip on power, he worked to get the support of the Anglo-Saxon nobles, and even married Ethelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, as a symbolic move to unite the two royal families. He ruled England from within, not as an outsider, but as a king who adopted the English system and bent it to serve his larger goals, because England was just one part of his maritime empire, which also included Denmark and Norway. But despite Canute's skill, his rule was still fundamentally Danish. His successors didn't inherit his knack for keeping the country in check.
After he died in 1035, the English crown started to get shaky again, until it eventually returned to Anglo-Saxon hands through Edward the Confessor, Ethelred's sign. The English probably thought their old dawn had returned, but they were really just living in the calm before one last massive storm. Because in 1066, after Edward died without a direct heir, England plunged into fresh chaos. 3 major players claimed the throne: Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon heir, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and the last big Viking claimant, and William, Duke of Normandy, who was actually Emma of Normandy's descendant. Harold Godwinson managed to fight off the Norwegian invasion in the north, killing Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But no sooner had he done that, he had to race south, only to be defeated and killed by William's army at the Battle of Hastings. And just like that, Anglo-Saxon rule ended. This time, it wasn't the Vikings who took the throne, but the Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France a century earlier. They came back in a new guise, not as sea raiders, but as knights carrying the banners of the church and a legitimate claim to the throne. And so the curtain fell on the final act of an epic that had lasted over 2 centuries. A saga that began with a burning monastery on Lindisfarne and ended with the crowning of a Norman king in Westminster. It wasn't a clear-cut victory for any one side. It was a complete reshaping of England's identity, where the blood of Vikings, Anglo-Saxons, and Normans all mingled in the veins of a single nation that would rise again from the ruins of all those conflicts. And with that, we have reached the end of the story. But stories don't end here. If you liked the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel so you receive all the new content. And if you have an opinion or something that caught your attention, leave a comment and let's discuss together. I'm waiting for your opinions and see you in the next story. Bye!